the money made in that space. So they will be increasing relative to the distributors who I believe are making the most money right now. Okay. So here's a comparison just to make this stark distinction clear between community open source and single vendor open source. By definition, there's only a single proprietor of the software. In single vendor open source, while community open source has a community of owners, facilitated through an open source foundation, but it's still a community of owners. Because that one firm owns the copyright, they can sell you the software, they can give you the software for free under an open source license, which is their go-to-market strategy, but they can also sell you a commercial license. For example, if you really want warranty and indemnification, which many companies want. Sometimes, increasingly more so, the single vendor open source firm will not give you the whole software. They will only give you what's called the open core now. They will give you software that is open source, but that's lacking some features, and they will keep the higher end features for the paying customers only. So that's the open core model. It's the typical distinction between a community edition for free to everyone as open source and the commercial or the enterprise edition where additional features are provided that only paying customers typically want. Single vendor open source is venture capital backed, frequently is venture capital backed, which implies that these investors expect a substantial return on their investment, very much like traditional closed source software companies. Community open source does not get such investment. It's actually very hard to start a consulting firm around open source only if you don't own the intellectual property. So you won't get venture capital if you're just providing consulting services for a single project. So that's why I explained in my earlier slides that community open source is cross-subsidized. There are commercial interests by selling complementary products. That's how you finance community open source. And the single vendor open source, the firm wants direct revenues. As I just said, the community open source, the money is being made elsewhere. In single vendor open source, the owning company wants to be at the center of the community. It's not a situation of equals. They want to be the center of the community, which is why they withhold lots of the intellectual property like trademarks so that they can sue anyone who tries to capitalize on what they are providing as open source software. So when I try to summarize what single vendor open source firms try to achieve, and I'll explain how that could possibly work or how it works, what they try to do is they try to go to market faster with a superior product at lower operational costs and sell more easily than it is possible for traditional closed source software firms. And I think this is the right perspective. I view, this may be provocative to some, but I view single vendor open source much more in the lineage of closed source software than in the lineage of open source software. These are firms like traditional closed source software companies who want to earn a return on investment for their venture capital investors. They just happen to find out or learn that taking an open source go-to-market strategy is a way of beating out existing 800-pound gorillas in the market, the existing vendors. It's a disruptive business strategy, so that's why they're applying it. So how is it different? How is single vendor open source, commercial open source different from closed source companies? There are three main things to consider. It's the revenue sources, it's the intellectual property rights, and it's the open source community. About in line with the size of the font here. Revenue sources aren't actually that different. Intellectual property rights, because open source is involved, is actually somewhat different. And the big one is understanding, learning, growing, and benefiting from an open source community around the project, around the open source project. What they sell is what a single vendor open source like MySQL sells is the core project. For example, the software that's also available as open source. Why would anyone pay for a commercial license then? Well, warranty and indemnification. You want to be on the safe side if someone sues you because something's wrong with the software. So some companies simply pay for a commercial license fee to be on the safe side. then whole product, sometimes features are withheld from you. So most of today's single vendor commercial open source firms simply don't give you all the features, but they give you all the features that a private user might want. But then if you're a commercial enterprise, you will only get the enterprise readiness features, more authentication, authorization features, better scalability in a distributed context, better backup, and what have you. You'll only get this if you actually pay for a commercial license. Of course, you can pay for operational comfort, support, hotline, bug fixes, and you can also always pay for support and consulting and implementation services. Commercial single vendor commercial open source firms bundle their products pretty much like traditional closed source software firms. They have a direct sales force. It's illustrated here in the rightmost column, where each of these small boxes is. So on the right there it says on the left it says enterprise customers and direct sales catering to enterprise customers. You see enterprise customers buy a license, an update service, some additional utilities that are not in the free open source version, documentation, training, and 24/7 support for the software. That's very traditional, like closed source software companies, and that's not surprising because if there's something that businesses want to figure out, of course, is how to make money and what are the various ways of doing that. So if it made money in the past, why not today? It's very similar to closed source software companies. Intellectual property now becomes a bit more tricky because these single vendor open source firms also make the software available under an open source license. So I'm kind of withholding from you why they actually do it. I'll clearly come to that, but they do it, and as they do it, they have to follow one thing which I call the intellectual property rights imperative. The best practice of these companies is to make sure that only this company is the company or legal entity that can give customers the software under a license of their own choice or potentially the customer's choice. Meaning no other company can use the software or sell the software under anything but the open source license. Only the company who started the project will want to be the one that provides the software under an open source license, but if customers are willing to pay for it, one or more commercial licenses. And for that, they need to maintain all the intellectual property rights to the software. So the way they handle the code and code contributions and the community always keeps that in mind. So here are a couple, for illustration purposes, of best practices that companies are following. MySQL, the database company, clearly did not want some other company to take its code base and start building a database business around it. They wanted to keep other competitors out, and in particular they wanted to avoid that competitors take their code base and start competing with MySQL based on it. So the best practice here is to use a reciprocal open source license, like a restrictive license like the GPL, that implies that if you make changes to the code base, then you have to provide them to whoever, and then you distribute, say you sell the software, then you have to provide them on to whoever comes asking for it. That means a potential competitor for MySQL cannot enhance the MySQL database in a proprietary fashion and build a sustainable advantage by way of these enhancements. Hence, they would not be able to build up such a competitive stance towards MySQL, and they will always be on equal footing with about anyone else who would enter that market. So there are no barriers to entering the market on services around the open source license, but you cannot build up any advantage by proprietary enhancements. That's what the GPL enforces in this case. So in an amusing twist, the GPL used to be heralded as a socialist or communist license or what have you, which is nonsense because it's just a license, but it's being used here for strong commercial purposes in a very effective way. Another best practice is MySQL, the database company, did get